This is my second lecture on Byzantine art. If Justinian's reign saw the Byzantines return the Roman Empire to some of its previous glory, the good times didn't last. Constant warfare had drained the treasury and provoked growing resentment at high taxes. What was probably the first wave of the bubonic plague hit the Byzantine Empire toward the end of Justinian's reign and may have killed off a quarter of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean and as much as 40% of the population of crowded Constantinople. By the way, this is a later illustration of the plague from medieval Europe. But to continue with the Byzantine Empire's string of bad luck, the Sassanid Persian Empire was replaced by an even more vigorous and successful power in the East. Any guess as to what that was? Yes, the Muslim Caliph swept out of Arabia in the mid-600s, pushed back the eastern frontiers of the Byzantine Empire, and recaptured the northern African lands that Justinian had just won back from the Vandals. A new wave of Germanic invaders, the Lombards, seized most of Italy. On the other hand, another barbarian wave, the Slavs to the north, actually converted to the Eastern Orthodoxy or Byzantine form of Christianity and eventually became an important element of a revitalized Byzantine Empire. Let's catch up with some of this history with our first video clip. As often happens during difficult times, people began asking themselves if they had somehow displeased God. One answer that Emperor Leo III embraced in the early 700s was that God was mad about how many icons or images of holy figures had been installed in churches. And he was especially concerned with a trend toward using these icons, particularly personal, small icons, in worship. Leo III was an iconoclast or icon breaker, and he forbade the use of images and icons that portrayed Christ, the Virgin Mary, and saints. This illustration from another illuminated manuscript shows an official about to dip an image into whitewash. Iconoclasm was especially strong in areas bordering Muslim territories, and some historians think that iconoclasts were influenced by the Muslim rejection of imagery. Some historians say no. Whatever the cause, the iconoclast controversy tore through the Byzantine Empire. It also, by the way, shows up on almost every art history test. After all, there are not that many pitched battles that are fought over art. I'll pause while you watch a couple of clips from a documentary on the Byzantine Empire. So here's an image you saw in the video of the very simply decorated, image-free Byzantine church of Santorini. Makes you miss those mosaics, doesn't it? So Leo III, as I mentioned, was the emperor who ordered the images destroyed. As you can see, the empire he ruled over had shrunk significantly, and the striped areas were constantly raided by Muslim forces. If I had been making bets in 717, I probably would have bet on the Byzantine Empire's imminent demise. So it's just as well I didn't get the opportunity to place a wager, because the empire actually revived under a series of Macedonian emperors, starting with Basil III. By the way, Macedonia is northern Greece. You see the capital Thessalonica. This is the area that Philip II and Alexander the Great came from. So under the Macedonian emperors, the Byzantines regained some territory in Asia Minor and more notably spread into the Balkans. Two missionaries sent Cyril and Methodius, shown here in a fresco from a Bulgarian monastery, went north and spearheaded the conversion of the Bulgars, the Serbs, and finally the Russians to Orthodox Christianity. Byzantine Greek Orthodox religion and Byzantine artistic conventions would live on in this region even after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So Basil I and his Macedonian successors also encouraged an artistic renaissance. They overturned iconoclasm, and they set out to refurbish the churches that had been ravaged by the iconoclasts. Not only did they build and rebuild churches with glorious mosaic decoration inside, the outside of the churches became more ornate in this period as well. So here you see what is called a cloisonné technique. Light stones framed by dark red bricks. You're going to encounter this term in my next set of lectures. Unfortunately, it's used entirely differently. It's a conspiracy to confuse students. So here's the mosaic of Virgin Mary and Jesus that was placed in the apse of Hagia Sophia once the emperors and church leaders had rejected iconoclasm. But as you can see from the background, earlier decoration had been destroyed. Note that in this mosaic, we see some evidence of a return to classical style. The artist employed, admittedly rather rough perspective in drawing the footstool. The robes are more geometric still than flowing. The figures are still rigidly frontal, and that flat hieratic style is unmistakably Byzantine. I've been debating with myself how much I should say about the theological disputes that roiled the Eastern and Western churches during the first millennium after Christ. It gets very complicated, but to way oversimplify, one of the biggest disputes was over whether Christ could really be at the same time fully human and fully God. Now, both the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox churches answered with an emphatic yes. It was the Arian Christians who did not accept the joint godhood and manhood of Jesus. Nevertheless, in the East, religious leaders were more concerned about artistic portrayals of Christ that placed too much emphasis on his human nature, including, by the way, his suffering. So instead, their favorite image, and the one that often adorned the apse or central dome, was Christ Pantocrator. By the way, I pronounced that wrong in my last podcast. I've since checked it. I should have then. So Christ Pantocrator, or ruler of all. Remember, too, that the emperors wielded autocratic power and that they headed up the church as well as the state. So images of God as a ruler served imperial political purposes as well as spiritual purposes. This is a work of art designed to inspire awe, not a little fear. That's a book of judgment that Christ holds in his hand. We're going to see more themes of judgment when we get to Romanesque art in our next unit. So here's a closer look at Christ's stern, even forbidding face. And by the way, the magnificence of these mosaics really takes my breath away. This is not the youthful Good Shepherd. You see some of the characteristic Byzantine features. They are large, wide eyes, long, thin nose, hair and garments that are more stylized than realistic. While Christ's human suffering is not ignored altogether, this is not really a realistic work either. The laws of gravity seem to have been partly suspended. Christ is sagging a little on the cross, but he still seems to be holding himself partly upright. Blood is spurting from his wounds, but in a very stylized way. I cropped this picture and blew it up so we could see Christ's face. It's sorrowful, but he's not expressing the agony that we will see in many Western depictions of crucifixion. Western artists in general are more interested in the human side of Christ. Probably the most spectacular Byzantine church built during this middle period is actually in Italy, St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, one of the most over-the-top and spectacular buildings you could possibly see. This aerial view gives you a better idea of its structure. It's a cruciform or cross shape with a central dome over the crossing. Remember where the nave and the transept cross each other, and 4 other domes over the 4 equal arms of the Greek cross. The mosaics in this church cover more than 40,000 square feet, and much of that coverage is in gold tesserae. I mean tesserae made from real gold. The central dome depicts Christ ascending into heaven, watched over by the Virgin Mary and the 12 apostles. So I was hunting around for a close-up of the St. Mark's Dome mosaic, and I came on this cool site. I hope you have an opportunity to stop and have Ms. Jacobs play around with the zoom and magnification feature so you can see this magnificent work in more detail. And here's the big picture. The doges, or dukes, who ruled Venice maintained their independence both from Lombard Italy and from the Byzantine Empire. But their art was Byzantine in style. Like emperors, the doges went in for knock your socks off overwhelming to highlight not only the power of God, but their own power as his appointed rulers. Note, by the way, the barrel vaults is a really good illustration of them and how the barrel vaults are combined with the domed construction. Norman Sicily was likewise heavily influenced by Byzantium. By the way, Sicily was ruled for a time by the Arabs, for a time by the Normans. Very interesting history and lots of great art if you're looking for another place for your list. Sicily at this point, like Venice, was an independent power. By the way, I visited this cathedral in 2013, and even though it was a cold and rainy day outside, inside the cathedral blazed with light, reflecting off all of this gold. This is a better sense, gives you a better sense of the brilliance, as does the photo in your book, which I couldn't find on the web. We looked at an ivory diptych earlier. By the Middle Byzantine period, triptychs, or three-part compositions, in this case, low-relief sculptures, were more common. Note that the figures of Mary and John and the Baptist are portrayed in the act of supplication. That means they are pleading for sinners before Christ. While the sculpture is still highly stylized, it does demonstrate a partial move back to realism and naturalism in Middle Byzantine art. And here you see what the triptych cover when it's closed. This is a mural painting, not a mosaic. So what features of this painting show some departures in Byzantine work? Well, what seems most obvious to me is the sky is blue, not gold, and the setting in general is somewhat more naturalistic. The bodies seem to have muscles and shape, and they overlap, so you have at least a little bit of an impression of volume. This illuminated manuscript also shows the more naturalistic and classical style of this period. Artists of the Macedonian Renaissance, like artists of the Italian Renaissance after them, would be deeply interested in the art of classical Greek. And as you'll recall, the art of classical Greek was very interested in modeling, particularly in the classical period and after. So note the allegorical figure of Melody. She's depicted as a woman looking over David's shoulder. The reclining figure apparently represents Bethlehem. And I especially like the animals, which not only have real bodies, but real expression. Here are a few more pages from this Psalter. Note again the personification of wisdom and prophecy. Frankly, I think they look more than a little bit like goddesses. Again, you see the influence of the classical tradition. With the defeat of the iconoclasts came a huge resurgence in the creation of icons. These are small objects, often used for individual worship. So what Byzantine features do you see in this famous icon? Theotokos, by the way, means mother of God. Well, there's the long straight nose, the small mouth, the Christ child with a long unchildlike body and small head, a flat silhouette, an otherworldly golden background. But note too that for all of its hieratic, notice I keep using that vocabulary word, for all of its hieratic stylized portrayal, this is still a very intimate portrait, suitable for personal worship and inspiration. This icon was probably made in Constantinople, but it traveled north to Kiev, and what today is the Ukraine, is the capital of Ukraine, and from there to Moscow. Russians, by the way, believed that this icon saved the city of Moscow from invasion on several occasions. It's a very important work of art to Russians. Here's a close-up again. Note how both sorrow and love shine through the stylistic conventions. I think this is really remarkable work. So when the Macedonian Emperor Basil II died in 1025, he left no clear successor, and the Byzantine Empire was increasingly ruled by its military and civil service. This was bad timing because new enemies were emerging. I've mentioned the Normans. They were advancing into Byzantine Sicily. We've already seen the spectacular Norman cathedral at Monreale. Even more seriously, a new group of invaders from the east, the Seljuk Turks, threatened the portions of Asia Minor that were still under Byzantine control. And finally, there were the Western Crusaders, fellow Christians, in theory, the Byzantines' Christian allies, who in fact repeatedly laid waste to Byzantine cities. In the Fourth Crusade, the Western soldiers pretty much skipped fighting the infidels and decided to sack Constantinople in 1204 instead. That's how the four tetrarchs ended up at St. Mark's in Venice, by the way, and that's when a lot of Byzantine treasures moved west to Venice. So by 1400, all that remained of the so-called empire were three small islands of Byzantine rule, now with separate rulers. In 1453, a new wave of Turks, this time it was, do you remember? The Ottomans conquered Constantinople. The Christians of the city took refuge in the Hagia Sophia, where they were massacred by the thousands. According to eyewitness historical accounts, the blood on the church floor was as much as 6 inches deep by the time the soldiers were finished killing. They were allowed to kill pretty freely for 3 days, and then the Sultan called a halt. Despite the political disintegration, the cultural and artistic life of the empire remained strong almost until the end. Churches, if anything, became taller and more elaborate, although nothing, of course, was bigger than the Hagia Sophia. They multiplied domes and cupolas. That's drums with shallow caps. You see them here. So here's a 19th century drawing of the church in Kora, which was rebuilt during this period. And here is the Paraclesion, or side chapel of the church, with its anastasis, or picture of Christ raising the dead to life. And I confess I forgot to look up the pronunciation for those two terms. I might very well have gotten it wrong. And here is a close-up view of what you just saw. Note that the return to naturalism continues. It's being influenced by developments in the West that we'll be studying soon. At this point, we're really pretty close to the era of the Italian Renaissance. But this is still not the natural world that Italian Renaissance painters of this period increasingly sought to capture. Byzantine art would also continue to flourish in Russia. Here we see an icon of 3 angels who appeared to Abraham. We see Byzantine features, elongated faces, gold sky, clear lines. These are very clearly outlined forms, and tranquil expressions. Whew! Lots of Byzantine art at breakneck speed. In our final set of lectures, I will move west to talk about European art in the early Middle Ages. Then, in the next unit, we will move on to the 2 golden ages of the Christian cathedral, Romanesque and Gothic, and finally explore the transition between medieval art and the Renaissance, and then you get a break.